Making Brains, an experiment in neural computing and genetic algorithms. Before jumping in, let's take a moment to talk about brains and neurons. This little creature is a rotifer. It spends its days swimming around in ponds, looking for food, eating, and responding to the occasional threat. It may even be able to learn. It's made up of about 1,000 cells. 200 of these are neurons. These neurons are wired together with a few thousand connections. That's all this animal needs to lead a full life. You would think, with that few a number of neurons, we would have figured out how it all works and could simulate it. We haven't, and we can't. We also know how it got here. It is the product of a few billion years of slow and steady evolution. Both the neurons in our heads and the neurons in the rotifer do exactly the same thing. They are switches that pass along information to other neurons that in turn pass that information along. All behaviors lay in how they are wired together. From composing symphonies to eating bacteria in a puddle, the basic machinery is the same. It also arrived after a few billion years of evolution. Artificial minds are showing up everywhere. Siri works pretty well, and there are neural nets that can recognize large libraries of pictures, play a mean game of Jeopardy, and people are even talking about doing away with UPS drivers. However, none of the solutions seem to work the way my brain does. I don't need to be trained on 10,000 handwriting examples to read. One or two will do. I don't believe the neural net in my head calculates n-dimensional gradients, cost functions, or any of the calculus and linear algebra needed to obtain the mathematical behavior of any of my neurons. So here's the experiment. Can we use evolution to create complex behaviors from simple neurons? To do this, we are going to create a creature. We're going to give it food. We're going to give it different types of food. But more importantly, we are going to evolve out of simple neurons a brain and a nervous system that can respond to its environment, learn, and continue to evolve. Here are the basic rules governing the experiment. Neurons will be a form of cellular automata, no state, simple rules, all behavior will be emergent. The wiring will be the output of a genetic and evolutionary process. Neurons will have no state except for a transitory one. They can be connected to one or more other neurons, no limits to the number of connections in or out. A connection can be excitatory or inhibitory, send a positive or a negative signal. The neuron takes these inputs, both positive and negative, from neurons that it is connected to, sums all the inputs, and sends the output to all the neurons that are connected to it. The rules for connecting neurons are very simple. A connection starts at one neuron and ends at another. A connection has either a positive or a negative effect at the destination neuron. So here's an example. The top two neurons with a value of 1 and 2 are connected to the lower neuron with a value of 0. In the next state, the lower neuron takes on a value of 3, the sum of the top two neurons, 1 and 2. In this next example, the neuron with a value of 1 is connected to the lower neuron with an inhibitory connection denoted in red. At the next state, the lower neuron now has a value of 1, which is the value of 2 minus 1. So a brain and nervous system will look something like this. So far, this is very straightforward and even trivial. The challenge now is to fulfill the evolutionary requirement for the experiment. This is going to be much more challenging. None of the synaptic wiring will be done by a human. These nervous systems will be evolved and the product of genetics and genetic algorithms. As deity, I may have to steer things, but the connections themselves will be evolved. There will be no direct coding of behaviors. The goal is to have our creatures respond to its environment, learn, and continue to evolve. Step 1 will be to build a genetic playground, a platform where we can experiment with the genetic algorithms needed to evolve our simulated brains and nervous systems. First, a shout out and acknowledgement to Lee Jacobson. Lee has an extremely well-written primer on genetic algorithms, including a clear code example that I borrowed. There will be a link to his site at the end. This is a general-purpose platform for developing and testing genetic algorithms. It's written in C++ and is running on Windows. I welcome any kind soul that would translate this to JavaScript. There will be links to all the applications and source code at the end. To test the platform, I implemented a genetic algorithm to solve the traveling salesman problem. This problem is often used to demonstrate genetic algorithms. The goal is to find the shortest travel distance between a number of cities. This solution uses evolution and genetics to find that solution. I'm not going to go into detail about how genetic algorithms work, only demonstrate this platform. Here's a quick tour. This is a set of random cities connected with a random path. I can set things like population size, mutation rate, and the number of chromosomes. In the traveling salesman problem, number of chromosomes equals the number of cities. The system will assign random values for cities and create initial random paths. Changing the number of chromosomes will change the number of cities. Here, I'm changing it to 60. Now we have a new set of cities and a new set of paths. Changing it back to 20. And now I'm going to press the Evolve button and execute the genetic algorithm and arrive at a solution. The display shows number of generations and the total distance traveled between each city. That's a very quick tour. Back to the business at hand. Let's take this platform and tailor it for creating brains. Instead of cities, we will evolve the relationships between neurons and their connections based on the rules of the game. This is the same platform extended for our experiment. Here's a brief overview of these extensions. First, each set of neurons form a functional group called the brain. Brains can be combined to build nervous systems for creatures. There are now fields that control how information is sent into the brain. What the maximum value is for each neuron, how many transition cycles this brain should execute. There's also a scale control that can display multiple brains on a screen. In the traveling salesman example, the fitness of any individual organism was simply the total distances between cities. Here it's more complicated. Each individual brain is evolved a function and has its own fitness function. I'll describe more about this later. Brains can connect to a simulated outside world through a set of 6 sensory neurons and 3 muscle neurons. There are also controls for animation. Animations can be single-stepped or run continuously at different speeds. Let's look at the relationship between neurons and chromosomes. Chromosomes actually map to synapses. Increasing the number of chromosomes increases the number of connections between neurons. Here I keep the number of neurons the same and increase the connections. I can increase both and create as complex a brain as needed. This example has 100 neurons with 1,000 connections. As I mentioned before, each brain can have its own fitness function. I've created 15 so far. This drop-down list lets you select which one to evolve to. As we evolve different brains and creatures, you will see how this works. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about creatures. Since our experiment is about making brains and not creating full organisms, we are going to start with a ready-to-go creature in a simulated world. I give you a critter. Scientific name, Critis simplica. It has a body that features two components that can be connected to the brains we are creating. It has a mouth that can open to one of four sizes. This mouth connects like any other neuron. The neural signal that it is given translates directly into the size it opens its mouth to. It has four food sensors. Each sensor can detect one of the quadrants of a food particle. These sensors also connect directly into a brain and function like neurons. If a sensor detects a food element in its quadrant, it sends a 1, otherwise it sends a 0. Here's the food that critters eat. Each food particle has four quadrants. Each quadrant can be detected by one of the critter's sensors. Each sensor has only one quadrant that it can report on. This gives us 4 major food groups and 16 different combinations. Later, some food will be noted as more nutritious or taste better. Now, all we need is a brain. Let's evolve our first brain. It connects to a muscle, the mouth. It opens as wide as the neuron input is, and it holds it open for 5 cycles. We will use this brain in all the creatures we will evolve. Okay, let's build a brain. First, we need to set up our initial conditions. Since I've run this before, I know that we need 15 chromosomes and 10 neurons. Set up this new world. We want this mouth to stay open for 5 cycles, so we'll set our cycle count to 5. Update the value. The muscle is actually connected directly to this neuron, so when we test it, we'll watch to make sure that this neuron stays lit for a count of 5. So we select our 5 output hold, and with any luck, we should be able to evolve this brain. Success. We have a best fit of 5. We can test this, and to see if this neuron stays open for 5 cycles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can then save this. Save. Call this 5 open.brn. Save. And there you have it. We've now created our first brain for use in our new creatures. The platform allows brains to be assembled into a nervous system. They can be saved and loaded as a single file. Right now, these components are executed sequentially. The next version will allow parallel execution of individual brains. This new version will allow the assembling of components to be evolved. Currently, I'm acting as an intelligent designer and specifying the order. The display can be configured to show and animate the entire nervous system, as well as a graphic critter control. Thank you for staying with me so far. We now have all the pieces in place. We have a simple model for neurons and synapses. We have a platform for genetic algorithms. We can use this platform to evolve functional neural simulations. We can now run the experiment and see if we can evolve brains for our creatures. This evolution will not take place in a primordial ooze, but on a sunny beach. I will switch from showing how the tools work to focusing on the creatures and how they work. Here we go. Time to build our first critter, a filter feeder. It will have no sensory input. It will open and close its mouth at a fixed frequency and size. This critter is made up of 2 brains. The brain on the top left generates a pulse every 5 cycles to create a regular heartbeat to start things off. The second brain is the 5-cycle mouth opener we evolved earlier. On the screen is also a critter controller that displays the status of the mouth and allows the creation of food. This view will also display the status of each neuron. The red border indicates which brain is currently executing. We turn the animation on. Every 5 cycles, the heartbeat is generating a pulse that causes the mouth to open to a size 1 for 5 cycles, then close. It does not sense the food. It's a pure filter feeder. If its mouth is open where there's a size 1 morsel, then it eats. As you can see, changing the food has no effect on its behavior. This critter's nervous system has 13 neurons and 18 connections. Now let's give our creature a visual cortex. Let it sense the presence of food and open its mouth to a fixed size only when food is detected. You will notice that this nervous system has 3 components. The first and the last are exactly the same as the previous, a heartbeat generator and a 5-cycle mouth controller. In the middle is a visual cortex. This brain is connected to the food sensors, and if any of the sensors detect food in its quadrant, it will cause the mouth to open to a size 1. If there is no food, the mouth will remain closed. This critter is now sensing and responding to its environment. With the animation on, you can see the mouth stays closed until I create food for it. It does not matter which or how many quadrants are filled. If it detects at least one, its mouth will open. Here I'm giving it different combinations to see how it responds. This creature's nervous system has 33 neurons and 68 connections. Now let's give it a more powerful visual cortex. It will sense the presence of food, as before, but it will adjust its mouth to fit the size of the food. I've replaced the visual cortex with a more useful one. It processes the sensory information completely differently. It sums the inputs so it can send the correct size signal to the mouth. As before, the first and last components are the same. Here I'm providing different food configurations and letting it respond appropriately. I'm trying different combinations to test that it senses all the different food types. No matter the combination, it opens its mouth to match the food it is presented with. I will stress again, none of the neural wiring was done by hand. It was all generated by the genetic platform. This critter's nervous system has 33 neurons and 38 connections.
Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Let's give our creature a more sophisticated pattern recognizer. It feeds only on 2-unit blue food. We add another layer to the existing visual cortex, and it processes the output from that previous layer. In this world, 2-quadrant blue food is the most nutritious and the most energy efficient to consume. Of the 16 food combinations, 6 are blue. This adaptation produces a critter that eats only blue food. This critter has evolved an additional layer to its visual cortex that provides more sophisticated pattern recognition. Much like Ray Kurzweil's hierarchical pattern recognizer, this new layer takes the output from the previous layer and further refines it. The 3 brains from the previous critter are exactly the same. This new layer filters the output from the variable size visual cortex and allows only blue food to trigger the mouth response. All other foods are rejected. As you will see, only the blue food causes the mouth to open. It does not respond to any other sizes. This critter's nervous system has 43 neurons and 118 connections. It only took an additional 10 neurons to add this blue filter. The other 33 neurons from the previous critter are unchanged. This new cortex layer is simply an addition to the already successful ancestor organism. Both organisms do fine in this world. Here I'm trying a combination of both blue and non-blue foods to make sure it responds correctly to all the different combinations. Let's add another layer to the visual cortex. This creature will feed only on diagonal blue food. It will have a complex multi-layered visual cortex. It will also take output from its previous layer. Blue food in a diagonal shape is the most nutritious and the most delicious, probably due to the increased surface area compared to the plain horizontal and vertical blue food. As critters are becoming more and more specialized, it only stands to reason that a critter would emerge that only eats diagonal blue food. Much like koala bears eating only eucalyptus leaves, these critters live on a very restrictive diet. This critter's nervous system is exactly the same as the previous, with only the addition of another layer to the visual cortex, the delicious diagonal food detector. This causes the mouth to only open for this kind of food. This critter is a very finicky eater. I will only go through a few examples. Because of the complexity of the new pattern recognizer in the newest visual cortex layer, each cycle takes longer. This nervous system has 63 neurons and 228 connections. That's 20 more neurons than the previous critter and over 100 new connections. However, as before, the previous layers remain unchanged. It is interesting that we've been able to create these increasingly complex layers and pattern recognizers without having to make any modification to the previous layers. Like our own brains, these critters carry with them the neural legacies of their ancestors. So, we have evolved 5 different creatures with varying levels of neural sophistication and diet. All of them can survive in this artificial world. They all have components of their nervous systems that they share. They also represent a stepwise set of changes. They all descend from the original filter feeder and carry the same heartbeat and mouth controller. However, each change may not be beneficial if the food supply changes. A blue food shortage would drive the last 2 to extinction. What works well in one environment might not work if things change. The rules that govern how their neurons and synapses work are all identical, and the wiring was genetically driven. All requirements of the experiment. Take a moment to look over this little critter kingdom.
Oz has spoken. Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Look right in. Oz has spoken.
I'd like to take a peek behind the curtain for a moment. All the behavior this experiment has demonstrated is emergent and based on the very simple rules I outlined at the beginning. The data model is also extremely simple. Neurons are an array of integers that change state each cycle. They have no internal state, or any memory or other functions. There is a pool of synapses that represent every possible connection, with each connection having a start, an end, and a direction. That's it. That's the whole model. This is the entire code that runs the simulation. It's small and fast. I've clocked it on a 5-year-old laptop at 1,000,000 neurons per second. There is one glaring inefficiency that would improve this tenfold that I will leave as an exercise for the viewer. One of the goals for the experiment was to create a very simple cellular automata model. No traditional programming, and all the behavior generated by the interconnection of stateless neurons. So what's next? I'm planning to add parallel execution of brains, the ability to evolve at the component level, not just the neuron level, the ability to learn, to have synapses formed based on experience. All behavior now is hardwired. So why take this approach? I think that learning how to make 200 neurons work together to create behaviors will help us understand how our 100 billion neurons work. It feels like we are trying to build a 6 million part 747 before we have flown a few hundred parts of Kitty Hawk. Our current neural net technology is attempting to mimic nature, but is leaving out processes that nature employed. Our brains are based on older parts that are still with us. Like the critter's 3-layer visual cortex, our brains are layered as well. The brains of my simulated creatures, the rotifer, and people are all produced by genetic and evolutionary forces. This octopus has about 500 million neurons. It can learn, it can solve puzzles. This one has figured out how to open jars. We can easily simulate 500 million neurons on a computer. However, we can't get them to do what this octopus does. I think the answer lies in taking a more biological approach to the development process. Thank you for your time. Please reach out if you want to continue the conversation. The application and source code is available at the following links.